My name is Marcus Webb, and I just watched my father-in-law read a will out loud to a room full of relatives. A will that removed my name from every page. 3 weeks earlier, he'd looked me in the eye at his own father's funeral and told me to step back from family matters. This doesn't concern outsiders. I smiled. I nodded. Then I drove to a small office 2 towns over and signed a set of documents his own father had prepared for me 11 months before he died. The next morning, his lawyer discovered that the will my father-in-law was so proud of controlled almost nothing. The house, the company shares, the land in Millbrook, all of it had already left his father's estate, moved into an irrevocable trust, with me as trustee, before the old man ever got sick. My father-in-law turned pale in that lawyer's office. His sister, who had already started measuring the living room for new furniture, called it a mistake. It wasn't. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back to 7 years ago, to a Sunday afternoon I didn't understand the weight of until 3 weeks ago. I met Eleanor Webb, my wife, in my 2nd year of law school, and I met her grandfather, Walter Ashford, at Thanksgiving that same year. Walter's house smelled like cedar and pipe tobacco, and the particular sweetness of apples going soft in a bowl on the counter. The floors creaked in exactly 2 places, the hallway outside the study and the 3rd stair, and I learned both within a week, because Walter liked to test whether I could sneak down for coffee without waking the whole house. He had hands like tree bark, cracked and warm, and he shook mine the first time like he was deciding something about me on the spot. That first winter, snow came early and heavy, the kind of pale grey light that makes everything look like it's underwater. Walter took me into his study, a room the rest of the family wasn't allowed into without knocking, and showed me a roll-top desk that had belonged to his own father. The wood was worn smooth in one spot, right where a forearm would rest for decades of quiet work. He poured 2 glasses of something dark and said, "Marcus, people will tell you what they love. Watch what they protect." I nodded like I understood him. I didn't. Not really. Not for years. Walter built Ashford timber and land from nothing after the war, and by the time I knew him, it was worth more than anyone in that family liked to say out loud at dinner. His son, my father-in-law, Richard Ashford, worked in the company, but never seemed to love the work itself. He loved what the work brought. I noticed it in small ways before I could name it. The way Richard talked about the Millbrook property, not as the place he'd learned to fish as a boy, but as 40 acres of undervalued frontage. The way he referred to his own father's care, in his final years, as the situation. The way you'd talk about a stalled shipment. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. There was a Sunday, my 2nd spring in the family, when Walter took me and Eleanor out to Millbrook with a picnic basket that smelled like fried chicken and warm bread. He showed me where the deer crossed the field at dusk, told me the names of trees like they were old friends, and let Eleanor fall asleep against his shoulder in the grass, while he and I talked quietly about nothing in particular. Richard was supposed to join us. He cancelled twice that week and never rescheduled. Walter didn't mention it. He just poured more lemonade and kept talking, and I understood, even then, that this was a pattern old enough to have stopped hurting him out loud. One Christmas, I watched Richard hand Walter a check instead of a gift, folded once, tucked into a card he didn't sign. Walter thanked him the same way he thanked everyone, warmly, without any edge in his voice, and later that night I found the check still sitting on the hall table, untouched, next to a hand-carved duck decoy Sam had made him in shop class that Walter had already set on the mantel where everyone would see it. Nobody said anything about either object. I noticed both. Eleanor and I married in Walter's backyard, under the same oak tree he used to nap under, and for 4 more years I sat at that family's table as Richard's polite, useful son-in-law, the lawyer who reviewed contracts for free at Thanksgiving, the one who was in the room but never quite of the room. I sensed, long before I could prove it, that something in that family was already being carved up in people's minds, quietly, at every holiday, behind smiles. I had no power yet. I only had what Walter had told me that first winter, sitting somewhere in the back of my head, like a key I hadn't found the lock for. Walter's decline started the winter Eleanor and I had our 2nd child. It was slow, the kind of slow that lets a family rearrange itself around a loss before it's even happened. Richard visited less than he called, and called less than he texted, and every text was shorter than the one before it. I watched him sit beside his father's hospital bed once, checking his phone under the blanket like a teenager, and I understood, without anyone saying it, that Richard had already started grieving the wrong thing, not his father. The delay. I overheard the conversation on a Tuesday in March, in the hallway outside Walter's study, the same hallway with the creaking floorboard I'd learned to avoid 7 years earlier. Richard was on the phone with his sister Diane, and neither of them heard me stop on the stairs. "Once he's gone, the company restructures clean," Richard was saying. "Millbrook sells first. It's the easiest asset to move. I've already got a broker looking at it. We just need him to actually go." A pause. Then, quieter, almost bored. "It's not cruel, Diane. It's just business. He's not going to know the difference anymore anyway." I stood on that stair for a long time. I said nothing. I didn't confront him. I didn't tell Eleanor that night. Not yet. I went back down to my car and sat in it in the cold for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I filed it away, the way you file away a fact you know you'll need later, even if you don't yet know what shape the need will take. What I did instead was small. I started keeping copies of emails Richard sent about restructuring, of a text he forwarded to me by accident once about the Millbrook timeline. I wasn't building a case yet. I was just making sure that if the day came when someone needed to remember what had actually been said, it wouldn't only live in my memory. I kept a folder on a drive Richard didn't know existed, and I added to it quietly. The way you'd water a plant no one else noticed was there. Around that same time, I watched Richard walk through Walter's house with a real estate agent friend of his on a Saturday when Walter was napping upstairs, gesturing at walls like he was already redoing them. "This whole downstairs opens up nicely," he said, "once we clear some of his things out." His things, not Dad's things, his, like Walter was already an inconvenience occupying square footage. I stood in the kitchen doorway with a mug of coffee going cold in my hand and said nothing, and Richard didn't even notice I was there. I realized, somewhere in those months, that I was invisible to Richard in a specific way. He saw me as Eleanor's harmless husband, the guy who did contracts for free, not a threat to anything he actually cared about. He never once considered that his own father might have seen further than he did. I decided, quietly, to let him keep thinking that. Invisibility, I was starting to understand, could be a kind of power if you used it right. Walter called me into the study alone on a Sunday in April, 4 months before he died. He was thinner by then, his voice smaller, but his grip, when he took my hand, was still like tree bark. He didn't waste words. "There's an envelope taped under the second drawer of this desk," he said. "Not for Eleanor, not for Richard, for you. Don't open it until I'm gone, and don't tell anyone it exists." I asked him why me. He said, "Because you're the only one in this family who's ever asked me a question he didn't already know the answer to." Then he told me, again, the thing he'd told me 7 years before, like he wanted it to be the last thing that mattered between us. "People will tell you what they love. Watch what they protect." I found the envelope 3 days after the funeral, my hands shaking as I peeled the tape off the underside of that drawer. Inside was a letter in Walter's handwriting and a business card for a woman named Renata Suarez, an estate attorney I'd never heard of. The letter was short. It told me that 11 months before he died, Walter had moved the house, the Millbrook land, and controlling shares of Ashford Timber and Land into an irrevocable trust, a structure that couldn't be undone by a later will, couldn't be contested by a disappointed heir, couldn't be touched by anyone who assumed the will was still where the power lived. And it named me as trustee. I called Renata the next morning. She didn't sound surprised to hear from me. "He told me you'd call within a week," she said. He was right about most things. Over the next hour she walked me through what Walter had built, quietly, over almost a year, while Richard was busy talking about broker timelines to a father who was, according to the paperwork everyone assumed still mattered, fully in control of everything. He wasn't. Walter had already given it all away, in the one form his son couldn't reach. I learned, that same week, that Richard had scheduled a formal reading of his father's will, the old will, the public one, filed years earlier, for 3 weeks out, timed deliberately around a family gathering so the transition would feel natural to everyone watching. I heard him on another call, this one through Eleanor's mother's kitchen door, giving Diane numbers. 40 acres at Millbrook, an asking price, a closing date he was already floating to the broker as if the ink were dry. He didn't know the papers he was relying on were already worth less than the paper they were printed on. Renata also told me something Walter had said to her in their very last meeting, that she'd written down almost word for word because she thought I'd want it someday. He'd told her he wasn't protecting the money. He was protecting the idea that a person could be loved for reasons that had nothing to do with what they might inherit, and that the only way to know for certain who loved him that way was to take the money out of the question entirely, quietly, before anyone had the chance to perform for it. I texted Renata 2 words that night: "I'm ready." That night, somewhere across town, Richard fell asleep certain of something he had already lost. I lay awake a long time, not from fear, from the strange, quiet weight of knowing something true that no one else in the house did yet. Have you ever had to stay silent to protect yourself, or protect someone you loved, even when every part of you wanted to speak up? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. Renata laid it out for me the way she must have laid it out for Walter, plainly, without drama. An irrevocable trust, once funded, sits outside the estate. A will can name whoever it wants as heir to whatever it still legally controls. It cannot reclaim what already left the estate through the trust. Richard's will reading would distribute what remained: some cash accounts, a car, personal effects, nothing that mattered to him. The house, the land, the shares, already mine to steward, under terms Walter had written specifically to keep Millbrook out of a quick sale and the company out of a fire drill. Richard tried one more thing before the reading. He invited Eleanor and me to dinner, just the 4 of us, and was warmer than I'd seen him in years. He told me he'd always respected how I kept my head down in the family, that maybe it was time I had a real seat at the table, some advisory role at the company, a title even, if I could just help smooth things over with Diane about the timeline. I said, "I'll think about it." I said it evenly. I didn't blink. I let him believe the door was still open. Eleanor's younger brother, Sam, caught me in the driveway afterward. He was 20, still in college, and he'd always been the one person in that family who noticed things without needing them explained. "You've been weird for weeks," he said. "Is Dad doing something?" I told him it would all make sense soon, and that I needed him to trust me a little longer. He looked at me the way you look at someone you're not sure you fully recognize anymore, and it was the first time the cost of my silence felt real to me, not abstract, not strategic. Just a kid who loved his grandfather and didn't understand why no one would talk to him honestly. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to turn. I drove out to Millbrook alone the night before the reading. The frontage Richard called undervalued was, in the fading light, just a field Walter used to walk with me, pointing out where deer crossed at dusk. I stood there a long time, the cold coming up through my boots, the grass silver in the last of the light. I wish this were different. I wish Richard had been the kind of son who would have sat with his father in that hospital room instead of checking a phone under a blanket. I wish Walter had gotten, from at least one of his children, the kind of love he gave away so easily to a son-in-law he'd chosen out of nowhere. But wishes don't change what already happened. What I have, what Walter left in my hands, does. I let myself cry there, quietly, not because I was breaking, but because I finally understood what it must have cost Walter to build that trust in secret, to protect the people he loved from each other without ever getting to see whether it worked. The night before the reading, I sat in my study at 11:50 with Renata on a video call, the house silent around me, Eleanor and the kids long asleep. She walked me through the final trustee acceptance documents one more time, unhurried, the way you double-check a parachute before a jump you'd already decided to make. At 12:03, I signed. Renata said, quiet and warm, "Marcus, for what it's worth, he chose well." I closed the laptop. I am 31 years old. I am the trustee of everything that family thinks still belongs to a will filed in a drawer downtown. Across town, Richard was almost certainly asleep by then, still confident about a broker call scheduled for the following week, still thinking Millbrook's fate was his to decide. He would find out otherwise in about 14 hours. The reading happened at Walter's house. The family gathered in the living room, where I'd once learned which stair creaked. Richard pulled me aside beforehand, still in that warm register from dinner, and asked quietly whether I'd thought more about the role at the company. I gave him a calm, controlled answer, that I appreciated the offer, but I wanted to see how the estate settled first. He smiled like a man who already had what he wanted. Then his lawyer began reading, and got as far as the house and the Millbrook property before Renata, sitting quietly near the back of the room, stood and asked to speak. She explained, plainly and without theatre, that both assets, along with the controlling shares of Ashford Timber and Land, had left the estate through an irrevocable trust executed 11 months before Walter's death, and that the current trustee was present in the room. Richard's face didn't move for a long moment. Diane asked what that meant for the closing date already floated to the broker. Renata said there wasn't one, and wouldn't be one unless the trustee decided otherwise. He looked at me like I was still the harmless son-in-law he thought I was. I wasn't. I hadn't been for almost a year. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain myself in that room. I just sat there, unmoved, while the version of the future Richard had already sold to a broker quietly stopped existing in front of everyone he'd hoped would never see it happen. Afterward, in the kitchen, Sam found me rinsing coffee cups that didn't need rinsing, just to have something to do with my hands. He didn't ask what had happened. He just said, "Grandpa knew, didn't he?" And I told him he did. All of it. Longer than anyone realized. Sam nodded slowly, the way people do when a thing rearranges itself into place in their head. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't look at me like a stranger. Walter used to say, "People will tell you what they love. Watch what they protect." For years I thought he meant something simple. Pay attention to what people care for, not what they claim to care about. He meant something deeper. He meant that love, real love, shows itself in what someone is willing to build, quietly, patiently, without asking for credit, and that the people who only talk about love are usually protecting themselves. Richard never got Millbrook, never got the broker's commission, never got the clean restructuring he'd promised his sister. He still works at the company, under terms the trust allows, and some days I think that's harder for him than losing it outright would have been. Diane moved out of state within the year, and calls twice a year, always about money, never about her father. Renata still handles the trust's filings, and calls me every spring to check on Millbrook, the way you'd check on an old friend. As for me, I still have the desk. Walter's roll-top desk, the one with the worn spot from his own father's forearm, sits in my study now, and there's a second worn spot forming where mine rests. I take my kids out to Millbrook in the fall, and I show them where the deer cross at dusk, the way Walter showed me. I think about him every time I hear a floorboard creak in exactly the wrong place. And I think some people spend their whole lives being loved quietly by someone they never fully saw. If you've ever had to watch someone you love get underestimated by their own family, I want to hear your story. Tell me in the comments, and if this one moved you, subscribe. There are more like it coming.